found in Daniel chapter 4. You probably know the story. It is the story of Nebuchadnezzar, a global leader in those days, global, and a powerful, powerful man who experiences what many powerful men experience. I could think of at least one such powerful man today who reminds me in many ways of Nebuchadnezzar. He is looking at his domain. He is looking at what he convinces himself he has built by his wisdom and his might and his power. Obviously, he's not the one that did it, but self-deception is a reality. And when you have a lot of people around you bowing and scraping to you and telling you how great you are, self-deception can become a daily thing. So Nebuchadnezzar is looking at his realm, and he starts talking about how he has done all these things, and it's all focused upon him. And you remember the story. God decides, not as if God decided right then, oh, I never saw this coming. Let's respond to this. God punishes Nebuchadnezzar by taking away from him the very things that should be the first means by which a person recognizes their creatureliness. Because he's ignored the testimony of his reason. Any reasonable person would recognize how frail our life is, how dependent we were as children and young people upon others, how dependent we are even at this point in time upon our food. And even the most powerful man in the world. I was at DFW a few weeks ago. I'm not going to be doing that much in the future. But I was there, stuck there for hours on end. And it was late in the evening. And it was during another interminable flight delay. And all of a sudden, there's this, I see this movement out of the corner of my eye and this crash. And I thought somebody in one of the restaurants had lost a cart or something down some stairs or something. But as I was walking by later, the maintenance guys are there. And I asked them what happened. And part of the roof fell in. A big section of roofing, because there was a lot of rain and wind and everything else. I don't know if that had anything to do with it or it just happened to happen, but this big old thing comes crashing down to the floor. And it was in D. And if you know the D terminal at DFW, the roof is way up there. It's multiple stories. It's probably 3 stories taller. So what if you're walking by? The most powerful person in the world can't avoid everything. We're all mortal. And we should know that. And Nebuchadnezzar should have known that. But we're also capable of self-delusion and self-deception. And so God takes away from him that which he has been ignoring. And he becomes like the beasts, and he can no longer groom himself, and his hair grows out, and he is removed from the human realm for a period of time. But then, at the end of that period of time, he lifts up his eyes toward heaven, and his reason returned to him. And it says, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. Now, before, when he had his quote-unquote reason, he had been an idolater. Somehow, some way, there's so many questions that could be asked, and the vast majority of skeptical or unbelieving biblical scholarship will dismiss this story. It's a pious fraud. It never happened. You don't have any evidence of this outside of Daniel, which, of course, yeah, I'm very sure that his contemporaries are going to be recording this. But the idea being, well, look, this man, what he says, couldn't have happened because we're naturalists, we're materialists. There can't be anything supernatural going on. But let's say God wanted to actually humble a world leader. So he takes his reason from him. And then in the process of that time period when he is reduced to this status, reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar. Now that he is not distracted by all of the self-deceptive elements of property and possession, having people following him around and telling him how great he is and everything else. And so I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. So all of a sudden, he knows that there is one who lives forever, and it's not him. That's part of the returning of his reason to him, is that it's not him. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, not mine. I thought mine was. I was an idiot. I was self-deceived. My reason has returned, and so I've turned my eyes away from my stuff and the stuff of this world toward heaven. That's what the reasonable person does. The reasonable person recognizes the brevity of one's life, one's dependence upon God. A reasonable person recognizes his own mortality and the massive limitation of the amount of knowledge that anyone can have. You know, many times I've talked about Jason Lyle, smartest guy I've ever met. Really is. I mean, just the highest IQ, genius level guy around. But the nice thing is, Jason's a fellow heir of grace, and so Jason will tell you what I know of created universe is minuscule. It's tiny. I can only know what we know now, and what we know now, we've forgotten some of the stuff we used to know, and we certainly know a lot more than we have in the past in some areas, but I still only know a portion of that, and that's nothing in comparison to what God knows. That's what the reasonable person does. The reasonable person recognizes human limitation, the brevity of our life. Even if you have a voracious, unending desire to learn, that knowledge dies with you unless you pass it on to others. And that knowledge remains extremely partial and limited in comparison to what God knows. So Nebuchadnezzar, his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation, and I don't. This is the lesson that he has learned. The brevity of life, the limitedness of mankind, the creatureliness. Remember, what was he reduced to? Like a beast in the field. Like a beast in the field. But the beast in the field had learned what the beast in the field should know. And what Nebuchadnezzar didn't know when he was strutting about in his fine clothes up on his palace wall. He had learned. It's God's kingdom that endures forever. And therefore, he says, and this is totally different than what the religions that he would have been raised in would say. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. All the inhabitants. See, he would have been raised in religious beliefs that would have taught him that the rich and the powerful, the noble, the royal, they aren't counted as nothing. They're next to the gods. But now he knows all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. This is a phrase found elsewhere in Scripture. Remember in Isaiah, all of the inhabitants, like sand on the scale, just little grains of sand, They can't accomplish anything in and of themselves. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven. Now, there's a lot of folks. I have a quote somewhere in God's Sovereign Grace from Charles Haddon Spurgeon. That's not much of a trick. About every book published these days has a quote somewhere from Charles Haddon Spurgeon. But this particular quotation is about how mankind is most happy to have God busily active in heaven, dispensing gifts to men and taking care of natural wonders and the weather and things like this. But men gnash their teeth when you proclaim the idea that God is sovereign in the affairs of men. So it's one thing. Oh, he does according to his will in the host of heaven. Sure. Yeah. Up there in the heavenly realm. We'll let God be in charge up there. It's interesting. I sort of go, well, if you're so all-fired concerned about mankind's autonomous will, why aren't you concerned about the will of heavenly creatures, for example? If it is dehumanizing for us to be the creatures of God under his sovereign decree, why isn't it wrong that the heavenly creatures who have so much power and live so much longer, shouldn't that even be a greater concern? But we don't think about things like that. So it's one thing. He does according to his will in the host of heaven. So even those mighty creatures, their wills cannot thwart God's intentions. He does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. There's what Nebuchadnezzar had learned. Nebuchadnezzar had learned what many people today simply refuse to confess: that God's sovereignty in heaven is just as real upon earth. He does according to his will among the inhabitants of the earth. Well, that's just sort of a general thing. That's not specific. That's not what Nebuchadnezzar said. He says, no one can ward off his hand. No one can ward off his hand. Now, what that means is God is active amongst the inhabitants of the earth. His hand is stretched forth in power, and no one can slap it away. So this isn't just some benevolent, general, he keeps the creation running sovereignty. He is sovereign amongst the inhabitants of the earth. No one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? What have you done? But is that not the very essence of mankind's constant response to God's decree? What have you done? Now think about the foolishness, and it is foolishness. Think about the foolishness that must fill the heart of an individual to say to God, what have you done? You say, no, we're creating God's image. It's a good thing for us to do that. Now think for a moment. What lies at the heart of this? What lies at the heart of someone saying to God, you need to give an answer to me for what you have done in my experience, or just generally in all of history? Here's a man who has been reduced to the status of a beast. He's had his reason removed from him, and in the process, when his reason returns, he has seen and come to understand who he is as a mere creature, and that he has no right and no basis for daring to try to put God in the dock, to use the English phraseology, to bring God before the court and demand an answer from him. You think maybe Paul might have had this story somewhat in the back of his mind in Romans 9? Yeah, I think he did. I think he did. Who can say to him, what have you done? The rhetorical question is intended to remind us that no one can say that. You and I know people who do it every single day, but the point is it shows foolishness on their part to do so. Because if you know the one true God, before whom all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, the one true God who's the maker and sustainer of all things, then you know he has a purpose. He has a reason for what he does. And he doesn't have to reveal that purpose or reason, but very often he does. What he has revealed is his actions will be in accordance with his own nature, with his own goodness. Not some external stuff, rules that he has to somehow obey that come from outside of him, but he is perfectly self-consistent because he is all good. But we as his creatures are never in a position in this life to have enough information to be able to bring judgment against him. No matter how dark and dreary things may look, we have the promise that God's working all things according to the counsel of his will. And so here is a pagan, an idolater, and God has dealings with him. And when he comes to his reason, he's a Calvinist. How did that happen? All we are told is that when you are a reasonable human being, you will believe that God is not like you and me, that God's completely other, that God has a purpose, that God is sovereign. You will recognize your creatureliness when you are a truly reasonable human being. Now, I say all this because there's so much in Scripture that speaks of God's sovereignty over human affairs. We have Psalm 115:3 and 135:6, and these basic statements of God does what he will in heaven and upon earth. This is the God that we worship. And then that becomes the extended discussion and foundation of the trial of the false gods in Isaiah 40-48. And it underlies the whole message of the prophets, and it comes into the New Testament as well. And it's foundational to what we are to understand about God and his nature and his, therefore, everything he does, including his self-glorification in the gospel, in and through Jesus Christ, is this fundamental reality of his sovereignty. Last night, I saw I did not listen to all of it, didn't have time to listen to all of it, but I had a horrible day yesterday. This is the essence of having a fundamental fear of a God who is actually accomplishing his own purpose in everyone's lives, in all that takes place. There is a point of recognition where we come to realize that not only does the world not revolve around us, we're born thinking the world revolves around us. We cry and our parents show up. A few years later, we fall down, skin our knee, and we cry and our parents show up. And we learn to behave in such a way as to get help, get assistance, get things, get attention. It's all about us. Maturity is supposed to be when we start realizing that it's not all about us. That's been lost in our society in general. But that's what's supposed to be happening when you grow up anyways. And it's supposed to lead to the fundamental recognition of just how mortal we are, how brief our lifespan is. Which is why Scripture says it's far better to spend a day in the house of mourning than the house of feasting. The house of feasting, you're not thinking about the future. In the house of mourning, you're faced with it. You're faced with who you are and who God is. So the synergistic impulse is meant to keep us away from the God who is accomplishing his own will. And there comes a time, by grace, where we really realize that God is God and we are not God, and that God can do with us as he wills and as he pleases. As he pleases. He did not have to save us. He could have done with us what he did with Pharaoh for his own glory. Could have done that. And I just think there's a lot of people who are absolutely terrified to trust the God who reveals himself in Scripture. That's why when you see people going off to the left, what's one of the first things they do? What's one of the first and almost universal things that people do? They dismiss the Old Testament Scriptures as having any true validity, historical validity. Oh, he didn't do any of those things. Why? Because the God of the Old Testament is so amazingly sovereign, as is the God of the New Testament. But when you take the Old Testament story away, then you can massage the New Testament to make it fit a little bit better, in essence. So, decree. And it's interesting, the same terminology that's used, for example, in Isaiah 40:48, comes into the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 1, where everything God does is according to the kind intention of his will, his good desire. When God acts, it's based upon his ultimate power and purpose and goodness. Elect according to the kind intention of his will. That is the greatest answer that could ever be given. To want something other than that, to say that we should be elect based upon our behavior and our attitudes, which is exactly what provisionism says. Why does God the Father give anybody to the Son? Because they've already believed in God, because they've already obeyed God, because they've already learned from God. It's all man's prior actions. Because your choice meets. The choice meets are given to the Son. And no matter how often you point that out, unless given ears to hear, it's going to be ignored. But there can be no diminishment of the reality that I can certainly remember when it first truly struck me. When I was first really faced with the fact that I had always used my traditions to tame the God of Scripture, to make him much less than he really is, much less threatening, much less fearful. I remember that. I don't want to forget that. That's a gift of God's grace. But it's right there in front of us. Any scripture we look at, we're going to see it. It's right there.